Welcome to the Bulgarian Troglodyte. My name is SJS, and today I'm gonna talk about my top 25 1960s films. So originally I wasn't going to do this video actually, because lately I haven't been in the mood for making solo content on YouTube. But then today, when we did the podcast on Ronnie Nazarin Talk channel, I kind of got in the YouTube video mood again. So I decided that I'm gonna do a quick video about my top 25 1960s films. And once again, this is a response to Solitary Ronin Films, who did his 60s list. And I actually already left this list on the comment section of Ronin's video. And I think most of these films I've talked about a lot on my channel, so I think I'm gonna go through these fairly quickly. And some of these I will also be doing on my podcast as Jeff recommends later on. And some of these I've actually already done on the podcast too. And also congrats on 1K subscribers, Solitary Ronin. I think he talked about that a bit in the 60s video, so it's great to see a channel like his getting to that 1K mark, as he really deserves it. I was one of his first viewers back in 2018, so that's how long I've known Solitary Ronin Films, since the summer 2018. So it's great that he made that milestone, and hopefully he will get the Ronnie Nazarin Talk channel to 1K as well. That might even benefit my channel, as I'm a regular guest on that podcast. So yeah, fingers crossed that they can make that channel 1K as well in the future. But anyway, let's start with this list. So I mean, the top 10 is full of films that I've talked about so many times. So we have Masaki Kobayashi's Harakiri, which is one of my top 5 films of all time. Seen it several times. It's even number 1 in the Letterboxd 250. One of the greatest films of all time. Great social critique, both of the samurai code, but also of the wider society, of the state, hierarchy, power. Some of the best black and white cinematography. Great performance by Tatsuya Nakadai. Yeah, a film for the ages. Another masterpiece. Then The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which I've watched many times. I've noticed kind of a pattern that I tend to watch it like always on February. I never planned to watch it on like February, but for some reason I always watch it on February. So this year I actually watched it on Valentine's Day. Remember, I had a great talk with my friend Tony that evening, so I watched this just before that talk, and he also loves this film and Jacques Demy, so it was great. I've talked about this film so many times on my channel again. I have a deep emotional connection to the film. It's one of like it has some of the best cinematography ever. Like the look of this film is how I want my life to look. So very colorful. Yeah. Love Catherine Deneuve, love Nino Castelnuovo. They are both beautiful and great actors. So many all-time great scenes in this film, and even though it's a love story, it has some deeper themes there as well, like political themes. For example, relating to how the character Guy like has to go to the army, and there, if you follow that thing a lot, there are some interesting social commentary in there. But then number 3 is La Religieuse, or The Nun by Jacques Rivette. So I did a in-depth conversation about this on my podcast, and I've talked about this many times on my channel, so I'm not gonna get into it now. But yeah, it's one of my top 10 favorite films of all time, and always love watching it. And I think it would be a fairly good entry point to Jacques Rivette's filmography, as it is a bit more accessible than some of his more cryptic films, although this is a fairly difficult film as well, I would say. Then my favorite Ingmar Bergman film, it's Persona. Again, if somebody asks me what is the greatest film of all time, this would be one of my nominations. It's just such a perplexing film. It's about so many different things. It's a really weird movie with all-time great performances by P.B. Anderson and Leif Ullman. Yeah, but this one I've also talked about on my channel quite a few times, and like I said, we will probably do a deep dive into this on my podcast sometime this year, so look out for that. I mean, there are many Ingmar films that we need to talk about. I'm not sure whether this will be the first one, as I have a couple others in mind, like The Virgin Spring and Passion of Anna, Autumn Sonata, Cries and Whispers, for example. So there are many Ingmar films to go for the podcast, but Persona will be one of them. Well, this one I've also talked about on my channel a lot. It's by one of my favorite directors, Yoshihiko Yoshida or Kichu Yoshida. It's Eros plus Massacre, possibly his magnum opus, although I slightly prefer Heroic Purgatory these days. And this is the longer cut of the film that I have on the list because there are two cuts of it. If you have the Arrow Blu-ray, it has both of the cuts, so I would recommend the longer cut. But this is one of the most kind of mind-bending films. I really don't know what it is about. It's really hard to talk about it. I love the very alienating, kind of brutalist shot compositions that this film and other Yoshida films have. And it's kind of has radical politics. It's like very ultra political, although it's not very clear like what it is about. Like I said, yeah, but really weird film, although Heroic Purgatory is even weirder, but not a very accessible film. You need to be into kind of really weird films to appreciate a film like this. And it doesn't help that it's over 3 hours long too. So if you don't kind of get in the zone immediately when you start watching the film, it's possible that you will kind of hate the film. Well, this one I've also talked about a million times on my channel. It's The Sword of Doom by Kihachi Okamoto. Another one for the podcast in the near future. So this is my second favorite samurai film after Harakiri. And it's again starring Tatsuya Nakada, just like Harakiri. And he's this kind of very gifted swordsman. And he's a very kind of nihilistic, very brutal person that he just loves killing and he loves having duels with other samurai. And we're gonna follow his journey where he again fights other people and kills people and treats everybody like shit. With beautiful cinematography, great set design. Toshiro Mifune gives like a great supporting performance here. He probably only appears in like 10 minutes of the movie, but it's a very memorable performance. And this is also a very rewatchable film. And this was actually the first Criterion that I ever bought. I bought on the day of release when it was released in the UK from the HMV in Oxford Street in London. So great memories. Then we have The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. My favorite Sergio Leone film, although I really love Once Upon a Time in the West, which will be also on this list. But what is there to say about this film? By the way, it says here that I've locked it 2 times, but I've seen it more times than that. But I've just locked it 2 times. But I've seen it kind of 2 times before I ever started using Letterboxd. But very rewatchable film. It's the like fastest 3 hour movie ever made. I love the three characters, but especially Eli Wallach is my favorite, and I love the sequence when he's kind of tracking Blondie through the desert and kind of torturing him in that way. I just love that sequence. Yeah, beautifully shot, so much character and atmosphere there. Possibly the greatest film score of all time, and yeah, so many all-time great scenes. Well, this one I did a deep dive on Chris Mohan's podcast last year in November. So if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, go check that out. But it's one of my again, absolute favorite films of all time. And when I rewatched it for that um, podcast, I kind of fell in love with the film even more than I had before that. But yeah, it's one of the key works of the Japanese New Wave. I think it would be a good introduction to that movement as it isn't like one of the most crazy of that era. Like I think it would be better to watch this before any Yoshida films or any Terayama films, for example, as this is a bit more accessible. Yeah, I love this shot here. Great movie. Then this one I also talked about on the podcast with Altes. I think we talked about this for almost an hour. So lots of thoughts there if you are interested. But it's La Chinoise by Jean-Luc Godard. I would say fairly underrated as it came in his great 60s period. But again, most people talk about films like Breathless or Vivre sa vie or Vero le Fou or even Alphaville, or Le Mépris. But this one is something that I just absolutely love. It's so political, it's so funny, and yeah, might actually be my favorite Godard. It's either this or Vivre sa vie. Definitely not for everybody. Then this is one of those visual feast films. This we will also talk about on the podcast, probably sometime soon. I think Altes already has this on Blu-ray, and this can always be found on YouTube as well. But it's Letter Never Sent by Mikhail Kalatozov, shot in the Siberian forests. It's about these people being stuck in the forests, and there is this fire, and it looks just absolutely stunning. Like you won't find better black and white cinematography anywhere, and that kind of visual awe is kind of the selling point of this film. And yeah, you're just in awe when you see every single shot. It's just like those what the fuck moments that how did they shoot this and this scene? How is this possible in the 1960s? Yeah, it's one of those types of films. Great ending as well. Like there's this shot of this character's face in the snow. There's a helicopter. I love that shot. Yeah, but such a great movie. I think again people tend to like this film, but to me this is like one of the absolute greatest films of all time, and I don't think it gets all the hype that it deserves, even though again it's a acclaimed movie, but not acclaimed enough, if you ask me. Then Vivre sa vie, I've mentioned this so much and many times as well. Probably the best Anna Karina performance, at least in like Godard's filmography. I think Anna Karina is so amazing in Rivets the Nun that might be her best performance, but she's so good here as well. And of course, many people say that Godard is a very cold filmmaker, but I think this is one that is less cold and has actually lots of emotion, and you feel lots of empathy when you watch this film. And it also has that experimental visual style, very interesting editing, for example. But yeah, an all-time great movie, and I think a fairly good entry point into Godard as well. And this might be one for the podcast as well. And the next one is for the podcast as well. It's Marketa Lazarova by František Flagil. So this is a film that I never know what to say about it because I watched it. It's an amazing experience, a visual feast, great atmosphere, and it just really pulls me in. But then if somebody asks me like, what is the film about? What are the themes of the film? And I cannot really answer that. So I think it's gonna be a very difficult film to talk about in the podcast. But although it might be very rewarding because I always learn so much when we talk about these films and when we do the analysis on the fly. So probably after I watch this for the third time and talk about it on the podcast, I will kind of be able to talk about it a bit more. But yeah, this is just one of those films that you just need to experience and not hear explanations of the film or whatever. Yeah, one of the greats, probably the greatest film of the Czech New Wave, if you ask me. Then we have what is possibly my favorite Besson film. It's Musette, which is based on a book called Musette. I think the book title might have been a bit longer, so it's Musette and something else, but the film is only called Musette. So this is one of like Bresson's most kind of emotionally heavy films. There are some scenes that are like brutal cut punches, basically. For example, the ending. It's a very sad film, and it has his trademark style where you see these kind of lots of beautiful minimalist shots that kind of focus on like hands, for example, and these kind of small details, and you really get a sense of Musette's world in this film, again, this young girl's world. And yeah, it's really brutal film, but kind of darkly beautiful at the same time. Yeah, it's just one of the greats. Yeah. Then we have Orson Welles' The Trial, which I've talked about quite a few times as well. It was funny when I saw this for the first time. It was in BFI South Bank in London, and 20 minutes before the screening started, I actually finished the Kafka novel in the theater when I was sitting in the lobby, because I sometimes read in the BFI South Bank lobby. So it was quite cool to finish the book, and I really love the book as much as this film, and then go straight into the film. And I think this is a fairly faithful adaptation, and like Orson Welles really is able to capture the Kafkaesque kind of atmosphere and the mood and the vibe. Kind of this film is so claustrophobic, just like kind of Kafka's writing is in a way. But of course, there are some differences in the film. Like the ending is like the some of the ideas in the ending are okay, very similar, but it's just the event kind of happens in a bit of a different way. So yeah, I think mostly a faithful adaptation, but some differences as well. And this is actually my favorite Orson Welles film. I just think it's such a gorgeous looking film in a kind of a brutal and again claustrophobic way. I really love Anthony Perkins in this. I think he's a great actor, and this is such a great performance by him. But yeah, I really love this film. Then we have my favorite Fellini film, although this is really hard to talk about, but it's Satyricon, or sometimes it's called Fellini Satyricon. But it's a loose adaptation of the Satyricon book, which I haven't read, but I want to read at some point. And this is again one of those kind of non-narrative-esque films. Beautiful shot after beautiful shot after beautiful shot. And it's really kind of about this period, about the life in Rome, but it again doesn't really have much of a plot, but it just shows like scenes that are kind of detached from each other to a wide degree, and then just then we kind of just what's the word? We just observe those kind of individual, kind of detached scenes and just admire the set design and again beautiful shots and stuff. But it's kind of hard to get the what the ultimate point of the film is when you watch it. Yeah, but this is another one that we will do on the podcast. Alta's just got the Fellini set, so yeah. Then this one I've also talked about many times on my channel, so it's Army of Shadows by Jean-Pierre Melville. In my opinion, his greatest film and my favorite of his. So this is one of the best war films of all time. It's full of paranoia, has beautiful blue-colored and grey kind of cinematography, looks stunning. And this is one of those films that it doesn't necessarily take a side, it just kind of shows that again all people are kind of bad in a way that again they are full of kind of bad intentions, and kind of all people are kind of morally grey, and they are all willing to betray each other and stuff. So you cannot really trust anybody. So it doesn't make the resistance fighters seem like virtuous heroes or anything, but Melville is actually very critical of the resistance, even though he was part of the resistance himself, I think, in World War II, if I remember correctly. But such a stunning film, a must see. Then one of Ozu's best films, and his last film actually, one of his few color films, it's an autumn afternoon, which is an utterly stunning film. This one I need to rewatch. It's been quite a few years since I watched it, but at that point when I watched it, I thought that this might actually be my favorite Ozu, but it's hard to say because again I haven't rewatched it. I think this is one of his best kind of tradition versus modernity films, I guess, as he had kind of been able to develop his craft, as this was his last film, and obviously it was quite a few years after the World War II had ended. So the society of Japan had a bit more time to kind of develop post-war. So I think that's probably the reason why the kind of modernity versus tradition works so well in his latest movie. And Ozu was also like a master of using color. Obviously, his black and white cinematography always looks beautiful as well, but he was also great with color. And this is a great example of that. Such a beautiful film, such a humanist film. Again, absolutely perfect in every way possible, I think. Again, Ozu films are comfort food to me, and I absolutely adore him as a director. And sometimes I think that maybe he was the greatest filmmaker ever, actually. So, yeah. Then we have Once Upon a Time in the West. So this one was something that took me a couple of viewings to appreciate. The first time I watched it on Netflix and I didn't like it, but then I got to see it on the big screen in London a few years after watching it on Netflix, and then it really clicked with me when I was in the cinema and I was in just in awe and I was seeing all these beautiful shots on the big screen and this slow but great plot and all these great characters and all the great kind of vibey scenes and everything. It's just such a great film, and Henry Fonda is such a great villain. Of course, usually he plays the stand-up hero type of guy, but here he is very different, but he pulls that off perfectly. And I think, like Rowling said, that this might be a better film than The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but I just think The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is just more enjoyable. So, as this is a favorites list and not the best list, that's why The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is higher than this, even though this might be the better film. Then another very political Japanese film from the New Wave era. It's my favorite Nagisa Oshima film. It's Death by Hanging. It's all about the capital punishment. It's all about the kind of hypocrisy, bureaucracy, and the idiocy of people in power. So basically, a film made for me. Um, but it's also a satire. It's actually a really funny film, even though it's about like a very serious political and complex topics, but it still manages to be funny. Like it's like the thing that is funny about it is that how he portrays the again people in power and how stupid they are basically. Yeah. It also explores a bit of that kind of tension between again Korea and Japan and the kind of xenophobia between the countries and things like that. So there's so much to unpack when you watch this one, and I think this will be for the podcast as well, as there is so much to talk about it. Talk about it with this film. Beautifully shot as well. And Nagisa Oshima was just one of the great directors. He was kind of a chameleon type of filmmaker that he had so many different types of ideas and he made so many different types of films. Then we have Bresson's Auhasard Balthasar, the donkey movie, which is just amazing. This was actually the first film that where I kind of fell in love with Bresson. I had watched a few films before this and his style kind of alienated me, but then when I watched this, it finally clicked with me, and then after that, I became a Bresson fanboy, and then I've also rewatched some of the films that didn't click with me back then, and then they clicked with me on a rewatch. But this is one of his greatest films, possibly his greatest. It's all about cruelty, it's all about the human condition. Very simple film, but darkly beautiful. Also, some of the best use of classical music in any movie ever, I think. Yeah, a masterpiece. Then we have Agnes Vardas, Leo from 5 to 7, my favorite from her. Just one of the greats of the Nouvelle Vague era of French cinema. Yeah, it's such a charming film. It might be the most charming Nouvelle Vague film. It's so entertaining. It just has the perfect pacing, beautifully shot. I love the main character, and yeah, there's so many great scenes like when they are playing music and stuff. It just has that overwhelming charm to it that you cannot help but love the film. It just makes you happy, gives you that good mood. But I need to rewatch this one as it has been a few years, so I forgot that much about it. Then we have 2001: A Space Odyssey. So back in the day, this would have been higher on the list, but and obviously it's one of the greatest films of all time. The last time I saw it was in the cinema in 70 millimeter, which was a great experience. Even though the guy next to me was snoring and stuff, and I also had to be in the front row, so I had to be like this when I watched it. But still, it was a great experience. But these days, I kind of feel like that I don't really have to watch this film again, even though it's great every time I watch it. But somehow I just kind of feel like dedicating my time to other great films. So that's maybe one of the reasons why I have it a bit lower than it deserves, because I just don't feel like watching it that often these days. So I feel like I've seen it. I know what the film is. I don't feel like watching it again, even though it's just utter perfection. I think I've these days find, for example, Solaris and Stalker a bit more interesting than this, even though this is as good as those films. But yeah. Then we have one of my other favorite Demi films is Lola, his first feature film, if I remember correctly. Great, kind of very charming film, all about love and relationships. It's a black and white film. It's not a musical, but it's kind of like a film that isn't a musical, but it still is a musical, even though it's not a musical, because it just has that kind of vibe to it still. Yeah, it's just the type of film that's kind of made for me. I just loved Ken Demi's charming relationship films with his great style. Yeah, not much more to say. Then we have Antonioni's Laventura, the first film of the Alienation trilogy, another masterpiece. I think these days this might be my favorite one. It used to be La Notte, but I think this is my favorite now. Apparently it's on the Criterion channel, but to be honest, I don't have much interesting things to say about this. It's been talked to death, and yeah, I don't want to make those very banal comments about it that everybody else makes. Then one of the Six Moral Tales by Romare. It's My Night at Maud's, a film that I need to rewatch. But yeah, this is possibly the best film of the Six Moral Tales, which is saying a lot, as many of them are amazing. Again, it's a very deep film all about these big moral questions. Again, the main character is a Catholic man, but his morality, his ethics are getting challenged in this film. So it's a very Romerian film in that sense that it's about very deep philosophical topics. And it like tonally it also feels a bit different than some of his other films. Feels maybe a bit more serious, but because many of his films have that kind of light-hearted charm in addition to the philosophical conversations, but this one feels a bit more kind of serious and perhaps even deeper than your average Romeo film. I need to watch this again to give better commentary on it. But yeah, maybe we will do this one for the podcast as well. But anyway, this time I wanted to go a bit faster with the films, as I have talked about these films before, and I don't always want to kind of repeat myself over and over again. But if you're interested in these films, definitely look out for the SGS recommends podcast episodes in the future, as we will talk about many of these films in the future. Some of these we have already talked about. But thanks for watching. I might do a 50s list as well when Ronin does it. Sayonara and arigato gozaimashita.